Hey, this is Charlie Thompson, and welcome to the lecture slides for economic geography. This is week one. We're going to go more in depth and look at some other issues with regards to economics and development and inequality next week. But for this week, we're just going to go over the basics. So this video is the video that goes with the textbook. So let's start off with some of the big ideas. Economics is fundamental. Understanding economics is fundamental to an understanding of a society. That's a big, important idea. Next big, important idea, that space, where things are, distance, how far apart things are, location, where they are each critical to understanding economic functions. Marxism is an economic analysis of society. That's very important in getting a good understanding for what's actually going on in a society. However, one shouldn't fall prey to economic determinism. I was going to say environmental determinism, which we tackled in the first week. Environmental determinism is the idea that the environment determines everything about a culture, and economic determinism is a similar belief that economics are the force that determines what a culture or society will look like. So it's actually, with both of those, reality is far more complex, and you can't just boil it down to economic or environmental determinism. Those are artificially simplistic notions. However, it's important. Marxism is still an important tool in analyzing economics and power and class and inequality and some other important economic concepts that we will get more into next week. So, sectors of the economy. Autarky is the idea that you are self-sufficient economically versus trade. So autarky, you have no need to trade with other groups of people in other places. Trade would obviously be the opposite of autarky, where you are trading with people in other locations. Basic industries are important industries that bring money into a region versus non-basic industries. Export is producing things that are going to be sold somewhere else. So in terms of the economy, one of the ideas of analyzing the economy is it's divided up into, I think now most textbooks, most geographers seem to be using 4 sectors of the economy. There's the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary sectors for the first, second, third, and fourth sectors. The primary sector is all about extractive industries. You're getting a raw material. So you're actually extracting a raw material. You're pumping it out of the ground. You're digging it up. You're cutting down trees. You're growing food. You're harvesting fish. Those are all examples of extractive industries. Often they're a key to national wealth. They can be. OPEC would be an outstanding example. All of the oil-producing countries often spurs manufacturing, because once you have the raw materials, which is what the primary sector is all about getting, the second step is manufacturing. That's the secondary sector, is manufacturing. Tertiary is retail, the service sector, selling the manufacturing things. And then the quaternary sector, we'll deal with that in a minute. But the primary sector, hopefully you can see how the primary sector of getting the raw material would directly lead to manufacturing, which is the secondary sector. Often there is a false dichotomy set up often between the economy and the environment, and that's really unfortunate. It's often used as propaganda by corporations who want to damage the environment. And their propaganda is usually along the lines of, well, we can't limit pollution and stay economically productive, economically competitive. You can't actually ask us to not destroy the planet, which is false. It has to be an and. There's no way that we can have a sustainable lifestyle without accommodating both the environment and the economy. And in fact, usually what this works out to is large corporations that are making enormous profits off of damaging a local area. So the corporation doesn't pay the damages. The local people are the ones who are affected, end up paying for the damage done to their environment, while the profits go someplace else. which leads into this control of resources. Like this is an oil pump in Los Angeles, an oil derrick rather, a pumping rig in Los Angeles. So who actually controls that? Is it the people in the neighborhood? No, probably not. It would be the corporation that owns the mineral rights to this land. So there's no local control. Often in these extractive industries, money talks, and money talks loudly. So often extractive industries lead to deterioration of the environment. And one of the reasons for that is that there isn't local control over those resources, that the people who live in this neighborhood might say, no, you can't do this. It's a toxic site. It's right next to where people live. You can't do that. But the corporation doesn't care because they don't live there. So the primary sector. Next, examples of Los Angeles, of the primary sector, oil derricks across Los Angeles. California's largest industry is agriculture, which is in the primary sector. Coal mining, a great example of this. Appalachian company towns in the 1900s in the United States, on the East Coast, largely in the Appalachians, which is an underdeveloped region, that corporations would create company towns. So you would work for the company, and in return, they would provide you with housing. And they would also sometimes provide you with what was called scrip, which is private money. So you would be paid. You wouldn't actually get paid money. You would be paid in scrip. They look like coupons that you would take to the company store and then cash in. So the corporations that owned these coal towns, these Appalachian company towns, have complete economic and political control over everything. As a worker in a company town, every aspect of your life is controlled by the corporation. And so you can't complain about working conditions. You can't complain about environmental conditions. None of that would be possible. You'd be fired. You'd lose not only your job, but you would be evicted from your housing. And on the scrip, so the company is making money by paying their workers substandard wages, and then they're forced to buy expensive, overpriced goods. So the company is making a profit off of the goods that they're selling to their workers with their own scrip. So multiplier, health issues, unionization in these towns often was put down brutally by either the Pinkertons or in many cases the National Guard. The actual U.S. military came in and machine gunned families, women, children, strikers. There's a long history of anti-union violence perpetrated by the state against people who are asking for a living wage. It's an argument that we haven't dealt with in this country at all, ever. I mean, we started with slavery and indentured servitude, and now we follow that up with company towns and the assassination and murder of union workers who are asking for nothing more than safe working conditions and a decent wage. So unionization has been dealt with very harshly early on in the United States with direct action, murder, and terrorism by the government and the forces controlled by the coal mines. Health issues in these communities. This is a pile of coal ash, which is incredibly toxic. And because the company has all the money, there's really nothing that the people in this area can do to fight the destruction of their environment. Another issue is this multiplier leakage. So if there was a good thing going on here that was actually bringing in money and attracting people, there might be a multiplier effect where those people coming in are spending more money and actually helping and growing the local economy. This is the opposite, because the money isn't going to the miners. In fact, as you saw, the miners aren't getting any cash at all. They just get scrip. So the miners aren't getting cash. The profits are being extracted and then sent to the stock owners in the corporation. So all the profits are leaving the community. The raw materials are leaving the community, and what's left is poverty and pollution. Often in these company towns, there is no incentive for economic diversification. It's just the one industry in the one town. In fact, Scotia, up on the north coast in California, is a company town. It was a lumber town, same exact deal. The only job in town was lumber. The housing was all provided by the corporation. But then because of economic factors, a long, complicated story with economic factors being a leading reason, that the lumber industry collapsed, with the result that the entire economy collapsed because there was nothing going on. And that's what they mean by similar industry. Cannery Row in Salinas is another example of, it wasn't a full-on company town, I don't believe, but it was all about the sardine industry. So the people that lived in that town were working either as fishers, getting the sardines, or working in the canneries that were actually canning those sardines. But when the industry collapsed, there was no diversity. Diversity is always a good thing. Studying ecosystems, the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more stable, the more resilient it is. And society works the same way. In this case, we're just looking at economic diversity, but Scotia, once the lumber town closed, the whole town just died. And that's what happens in these coal towns, especially now with the shift from incredibly polluting extractive industries like coal to renewable resources. Secondary industries are processing and manufacturing. They add value, like the difference between a pile of logs and, I don't know, fancy toothpicks. Drawing a blank here. The fancy toothpicks would cost more per weight than just the pile of logs. So that's what I mean by value added. And the value in this case was added by the labor of the workers. So secondary industry would be processing or manufacturing. Los Angeles manufacturing examples. Aerojet, Rocketdyne, they make aerospace parts. Legalize LA. If it's a dispensary, then that would be in the tertiary sector. So the weed growers would be in the primary sector. Oh, the trimmers and the processors would be in the secondary sector, and then the dispensaries would be in the tertiary sector. And then the people who track the economic trends and look at the data would be in the quaternary sector. Moog, synthesizers, all these examples of manufacturing in Los Angeles. Factors of production. Where do you put a factory? There are economic, so again, because this is a chapter on economics and development, land is expensive, labor is expensive, capital refers to money. So investment, all of those are important in deciding where to site a factory or a mine or a store. So there's industrial site location analysis. We'll look at the Weber model in just a minute. Labor cost versus skill. Yeah, if corporations' dreams came true, then incredibly skilled workers would provide their services for free, providing no cost and high skill. Labor wants the highest skill they can get at the lowest possible cost. Some other examples of factors that determine where you put things: cost of living. We just saw Elon Musk say, that's it, I'm leaving California and going to Texas because it's cheaper for the workers. That's a pretty common thing for corporations to pick up and move to a place where their workers could have, being paid the same wage, could have a better quality of life. And footloose industries refer to industries that don't have a fixed location. For example, the timber industry, cutting down trees and making them into lumber, it's going to be limited to the climates where there are trees and forests, extensive forests that would be good to cut down. So that corporation, that industry is really fixed. Like the cotton, we saw early on the black belt soils and the production of cotton. That would be another example where, due to climate and soil, you can't just grow cotton anywhere. Also, land price would pay into that, right? You're not going to grow crops that aren't making a lot of money on downtown property because that's the most expensive real estate. So footloose industries, I think Graves uses the example of the textile industry as one that can just pick up and move wherever they want. They don't have a lot of requirements. Sewing machines are very, very transportable. The tables, all that equipment, they can just pick up and move and open a factory someplace where the labor would be cheaper. So all of these aspects go into industrial site location analysis. Oh, fall line cities would be the example of the exact opposite. I'm going to go back to the previous page. Footloose industries are mobile, or they can be mobile. So the fall line cities the fall refers to waterfalls, and it's on the East Coast, and there's this line where the mountains of the Appalachians meet the coastal plain, and in that region there's lots of waterfalls and streams, which were useful for powering mills in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So a lot of these textile mills moved out of New England. New England had a strong labor tradition, which would have resulted in living wages and good working conditions, while a lot of the textile industry moved to the American South because they don't have that tradition of labor, because they can get people who, because of the mechanization of agriculture, are unemployed and therefore would be happy to work for low wages. NAFTA, I'll talk a lot more about next week. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement between the US and Canada and Mexico. That resulted in corporations often leaving the United States. The footloose industries, and in some cases like the automotive industry, which really isn't considered footloose because of all of the machinery in the factories, they also typically moved to Mexico to take advantage of lower labor costs. Free trade, again, we're going to be talking about NAFTA next week. Why not just direct trade barriers and have everything self-sufficient within your country? Because it doesn't work. It's very, very, very difficult to do. India has done that in the past. They're not doing it at present. There's all kinds of things that you have to do to restrict trade. Again, we'll talk about that next week. The principle of comparative advantage I find totally fascinating. You've probably run across this in your econ class in high school. And it's the idea that if, for example, in my town, because of the site and situation factors, we can make high quality shoes and turn a profit. And in the town next door, let's say that their site and situation factors are such that they can make cookies at low cost and turn a high profit. Well, the principle of comparative advantage would say, well, then they should make those cookies and export them because they can make that cheaply and make lots of money. And in my town, we should make shoes and export those. Well, it turns out that the entire theory of comparative advantage is based on a series of assumptions that aren't true. The assumption with comparative advantage was that, so again, we had these two towns. My town's making shoes and your town is making cookies. One of the premises of comparative advantage is that labor and capital are both fixed and unable to move. So workers and investment don't move. Well, but they do move. So if the workers in your town, the cookie town, are willing to work for a lower wage, then my shoe factory is going to relocate to your town because of absolute advantage. That because of the conditions there, they would be able to produce them more cheaply, and that's what they would do. They wouldn't stay in my town because of the whole idea of comparative advantage. It's bogus. It's wrong. It's completely wrong. It doesn't exist. The idea that you could have comparative advantage, it doesn't exist. There's only absolute advantage. Whichever area can produce goods the cheapest, they have the advantage over everybody. Nike and Cummins. Cummins was a weird story where there were, to protect, this is a great example. Let me back up one page. Let me back up 2 pages. Cost of living, footloose industries, right? So we're talking about industries that are fixed. Cummins makes diesel engines. And because of Mexican trade policy, they had tariffs, which are taxes. We'll talk more about those next week. They had tariffs on imported goods. So it was actually cheaper for Cummins to make their engines in Mexico to avoid those tariffs on imported goods. Well, after NAFTA, they did away with all those tariffs between the US and Canada and Mexico. And so then it was actually cheaper for Cummins to to bring back all the machinery to the United States and have it made in the US. However, what really happened with most of the automotive corporations, the trend was that they moved from the US to Mexico because wages were so much cheaper in Mexico. So who wins? The corporations. Who loses? The workers. And we'll look at example after example after example next week. Containerization, we talked about this in week 1. The idea of containers radically transformed the economics of shipping and made it economically feasible to ship goods all the way around the world. And those goods still be cheaper than manufacturing that good in that country that you're importing it to from China. So it resulted in the shift of jobs. It resulted in the loss of shipping jobs because now it's all mechanized. It's much more efficient. Much less time is required. Containerization was huge. The standardized shipping container was incredibly important in creating the modern system of trade. For example, all of the goods that the U.S. imports from China, all that's made possible in part by shipping containers. Break of bulk refers to when they actually have to break apart. So these shipping containers, they're not just going to put that on the shelf at the store. This is probably a port, could be Oakland, where they're taking the containers off. And then if they have to open up the containers and move the stuff, take half the stuff out and put it into another container or put it onto a semi-tractor, into a semi-truck, that's break of bulk. And there's costs associated with that whenever they break bulk, or I guess create bulk, either way. So they try to avoid it. Transportation costs, they try to avoid those. So putting everything as close to where you're going to need it and minimizing the shipping is still important, as well as trying to minimize the number of times you have to break down and reorganize the shipped goods. Okay, I just talked about Mexico and how they had these tariffs, these taxes on imported goods. So that would be an alternative to free trade, where we're just saying, yes, other countries, we will import everything from you no matter what. The opposite of that would be protectionism. This would be an example. I think this is a Lada, which was the only car you could buy in the Soviet Union, or one of the only cars you could buy in the Soviet Union. There was just the one car. You could buy the one model. And that was, they were in internal autarky. That would be an example of autarky, where they're producing goods for domestic consumption. They're not producing anything for export. They're not importing anything. They're not exporting anything. Everything they need, they're making in the domestic market. So again, import substitution and protectionism in free trade, the role of the International Monetary Fund, we'll pick that up next week. Protectionist measures, Africa doing almost nothing to protect their industries. India, Russia, the United States, Argentina, among the strongest protectionist measures taken since 2008. Japan also historically has had a variety of protectionist trade policies in place. We'll talk about those next week. Land, not every location is suitable for manufacturing. In determining where to put things and what to use the land for. So just looking at this, we would guess, as a geographer, this is the downtown, the Central Business District, the CBD. Another CBD, the Central Business District, where the land prices are the highest. And so to take advantage of that high land price, they're not growing wheat. They don't have manufacturing plants. They have skyscrapers, multi-story buildings to take advantage of that high land cost. So we talked about accessibility and distance and cost in determining where to put something. We haven't looked at the Weber method yet. Diseconomies of scale. An economy of scale would be when you're doing something on a large scale, it's often cheaper to do it on a very, very large scale. But sometimes there's a diseconomy of scale where it's actually harder to do things on a large scale. For example, moving 18-wheelers in and out of the Central Business District is very, very difficult to do. So actually having a central business district, a congested, popular central business district would be an example of a diseconomy of scale. If you had a shipping company or a trucking company or a distribution warehouse, you wouldn't put it in the middle of the town. You'd put it on the outskirts of the town, probably as close as you could to the freeway off-ramps that you determined to be the best. So diseconomies of scale are when, for example, the urban area, downtown, and the high traffic and lack of parking make it impossible to do some sort of economic activity there. Transportation costs, we can look at bulk gaining with a market orientation or bulk reducing with a materials orientation. So beer is just water with some yeast and some hops and some alcohol in it. So the raw materials are a pile of hops and a pile of barley and a whole lot of water. So the finished product is bulkier. Beer is a bulk gaining product. Toothpicks would be a bulk reducing. We've got these piles of logs and we're going to trim them all down into toothpicks. That's bulk reducing. So bulk reducing, you would want the factory right there, right? There's no reason to ship the logs because what we really want to do is ship around the toothpicks. So we're going to actually manufacture on site. That would be the best for a bulk reducing or materials orientation. You would be manufacturing on site. With a bulk gaining, with a market orientation, you would try to manufacture as close to the site of distribution as possible. So you wouldn't, well, Guinness, this is a horrible example. I was going to say, you wouldn't make beer in Ireland and then ship it all over the world. What you would in fact do is set up breweries all over the world, have them brew the beer, and then ship it within that town. So around Los Angeles, for example, or the Anheuser-Busch brewery in Fairfield. So it's easier for them to make the beer locally and then ship it locally. That would be an example of a bulk gaining product where the manufacturing would be as close to the market as possible. And here's Weber's location model. So we've got supply costs, transport costs, and then where to put the factory. And it's using an economic model. It's also called, I think, sometimes a gravity model, where the more expensive an item is or a factor is, the greater a pull it exerts. So if transportation is your major cost, in this case, it looks like the supply is the dominant factor, so you're going to put the factory closer to that supply for whatever reason. Weights pull optimal location towards, I'm just going to ignore that, least cost. So if this is the position that would result in you being able to produce this at the lowest cost, then you'd put it closer to this supply than this supply and farther. You would increase your transportation and increase your distance from that supply because for whatever reason, this supply cost is the greatest. Capital, going back to money and investment dollars. Venture capital are private firms that invest in companies that they think are useful. Government capital, doing things like paying for education and research. Human capital would be education, health, culture, women. All of those would be the building blocks that create human capital. This would be investing in human capital, investing in the rights of women, investing in cultural amenities, health, education, all of those, an investment in human capital. Auto manufacturing as an example of a whole bunch of different things. So why they've put the factories where they've put them, how as times have changed and economic factors have changed, how has the pattern of auto manufacturing shifted? So it was centered in Detroit. It was a good spot back in the day. However, in the 80s to the 2000s, there was a shift of new auto plants being built in small towns because they could get low wage workers. So we have U.S. auto manufacturing. In fact, the only when Steve Graves was writing this chapter, the only non-East Coast auto manufacturing plant was Tesla in California, which I believe is now moving out of state. So that's interesting. Here you can see the cluster around Detroit, and then they shifted, just like the textile industry shifted from the northeastern United States to the south. Many auto manufacturers are relocating in the south because, again, low wage costs, and they have a long history of not being unionized. And next week, we'll look at examples of how unionization is linked to higher wages for the workers. There's a direct connection between unionization and better conditions for the workers. Oh, in fact, we'll talk about this. Yeah, Amazon right now is trying to bust a union that's trying to form at one of their plants by a variety of mechanisms. We'll talk about that next week more. Just-in-time manufacturing was a revolution started by the Japanese in which the parts to be manufactured into something arrive just in time. So you don't have a warehouse. There's no warehouse where the parts are sitting. You don't have people sitting around in the warehouse shuffling around the parts. The parts are delivered right from whatever factory they're being manufactured in to the factory that they'll be used in. So this can result in lower wage jobs, the outsourcing to non-union jobs. Also, potentially, Graves points out that because the factories are set up, there's no storage space. There's no holding area. Everything they need arrives literally just in time. So if you were one of the areas where the parts are coming from and you strike, you could cripple the factory because they wouldn't have the incoming parts just in time, right? Just in time. Nope, they're not in time. They're late. So there's been examples of labor activists using this critical function of just-in-time delivery of parts by going on strike, which then shut down the factory because they weren't getting their parts just in time, which led to better conditions for the union. However, the general result of just-in-time is outsourcing of jobs to non-union jobs because you can pay people less. So the tertiary industry, remember, is the service sector. Primary is extractive, getting raw materials. Secondary is manufacturing. Tertiary is the service sector, now more important than ever. Includes retail, research, transportation, communication, utilities, tourism, etc. There is a multiplier leakage in a good way from these, an increasing concentration of power and wealth that it's a positive feedback loop, that the wages from this sector then create more money that creates more attractive conditions on one hand. On the other hand, it's also resulted in the Walmarting of the economy, where we see, instead of a wide spectrum of jobs, we see the creation of a whole bunch of low-wage, low-skill jobs at Walmarts that require people going on public assistance, getting food stamps because they're not getting paid enough at Walmart. And what this looks like then is stagnant wages for the lowest quintile of the population. So if you took, everybody in the U.S. and put them into 5 buckets, evenly space them out, the lowest 20%, their wages or their income rather, hasn't really increased from 1950 to 2010. As it hasn't increased nearly as much as this would be the 5%, the richest 5% of people in the United States, going from 60 to 120 to almost $200,000 a year income. So a tripling of their income at a same time when the lower income maybe doubled. So we have 2 doublings. Yeah. Because of the proliferation of these very low-paying service jobs, which has created growing income inequality. We'll talk about that. The Gini coefficient is a measurement of income inequality. 0 would be everybody's making the same amount of money. 1 would be like there's one Bill Gates and everybody else has nothing. So California and Texas and New York are the worst states for income inequality. Here we've got across the whole country, and it's interesting. So I've talked about this before, the scale. So in this case, we're mapping the data at the state scale. So we're looking at inequality across the entire state. And we've got New York, Texas, California, with the most unequal conditions. But if we look at it by counties, Texas, it looks like county by county varies a great deal between much more equal and much more unequal. Los Angeles, hella unequal. Whatever this one is, Alpine County maybe? Much of Nevada, where there probably isn't anybody. The Black Belt region has very high inequality. And I'm just going to guess that much of the inequality in New York is clustered in the very, very wealthy sectors, and that there's enough wealthy people there to skew the results for the whole state. But it's often very interesting to see how the same data maps differently at different scales. So again, this is the counties. Looking at things county by county looks very different, much more detailed, much more nuanced and subtle details than looking at it state by state. Looking at it across the world, the US, Russia are some of the most unequal. Sweden, surprisingly unequal, as opposed to Europe. For example, Spain is 65 to 69, someplace in there. The US over 90 looks like. Tourism as an economic activity. It's a basic industry. It attracts money. Geographically dispersed, but often suffers from multiplier leakage when there isn't local control. If you go to, I think Graves points out, like an all-inclusive resort, the profits are going outside the community. So the people who work at the resort are earning low income. They have low income jobs at the resort. The people coming to the resort are paying lots of money, but that money is getting taken out of the community. It's not being given to the workers. It's going to the shareholders in Sandals or Club Med or whatever. The Quaternary Sector, the information sector, education, government, financial software, high tech. Silicon Valley, great example of the Quaternary Sector. Richard Florida is a guy that's written a lot about the creative class and what creates an attractive working environment for some of the people in the Quaternary Sector, people especially in entertainment, in high tech, that the conditions required to create these incredibly profitable organizations, tolerance turns out to be key in the community. So there's many states, like Georgia is right now losing out on some monies because of their discriminatory policies. All the states in red are places where you can be fired just for being gay. Doesn't matter. Yeah, you can just be fired for being gay. So the states that have these reputations are not attracting the best workers. They are not attracting the best companies. In fact, what we see is the opposite. We see the dumb state death spiral, where the smart people, the talented people, the diverse people from these states are moving to states that are more welcoming, states that have a better quality of life, states where you won't get your car or your house won't be egged or burned because you're gay. Fire industries stand for finance, insurance, and real estate. That there's a couple centers, cities where there's a positive feedback loop. Hartford, Connecticut began insuring people. Dover, Delaware is the capital of, if he's not going to tell you, yeah, it's credit cards, because Delaware changed their laws about the amount of interest you can charge on credit cards. That's where the credit card companies went to. So that's what created the situation of Dover, Delaware being the home to most of the credit card corporations. A couple analysis things you can do with business geography. This is determining if the industries, some of the employment in your town, how it compares. So it's this one industry in your town compared to all the industries in your town, divided by all of that industry to all of the industries. anything over 1.0 indicates a surplus. And he goes through the math in the book of looking at, might have been hotels, to determine if your town has more basic or fewer basic economic activities. Retail site location intelligence, lots and lots and lots of money spent on where do you open a new one? Location. Yeah, where do you open a new one? Also, where do you close a store? If the economy is tanking, do you close all of them? Do you just close a few of them? And if you're just going to close a few of them, how do you decide which locations you're going to close? And the answer is location intelligence, which is a very important geographic skill. The hoteling model, I got to tell you, I was confused about this because of the hotel part. It's the guy's name. It's got nothing to do with hotels. It's just a model that tries to explain. Oh, right. I got it. It's a model that tries to explain why the world looks the way it does. And what the hoteling model says is agglomeration of certain businesses or industries is explained by the logic of competition. What? So, if the product is the same, gasoline, customers go to the closest store. If there's an intervening opportunity, like if there's a gas station that you pass on the way to the gas station that you're going to go to, you're just going to go to the cheaper, closer gas station. That's it. This also then explains why you have clusters of gas stations, because, the gas is all the same. It's just, which one's closest. So you've got Amy's location and Joe's location. If Amy shifts here and Joe, I don't think this is a really, really good example. I'm just going to go with the gas stations. You're going to put the gas stations where you put them in an attempt to capture the market. So, yeah, it's not clear what the hell's going on with Amy and Joe. I don't think this is a very useful, but it's in the textbook, so I thought I should talk about it. So if Joe is trying to move west, then Amy will shift. And eventually, Amy and Joe, so here's the deal. They were far apart, and they're going to end up right next to each other because they're selling the same stuff. Amy's gas station, Joe's gas station. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. We're not going to do this. Closer stores attract more customers. Bigger stores attract more customers. Distance discouraging shopping. I think actually just looking at all of that, that's enough. That's good enough. Bigger stores, malls attract more customers. Closer stores attract more customers. Distance discourages shopping. That's, I want to say obvious. I guess if you stop and think about it, it's obvious. That would be the Huff model. Marketing geography. Yeah, where do you spend marketing dollars? Target marketing efforts to match customers with retailers. Landscape geography, using exotic landscapes to sell Corona beer. Abercrombie and Fitch, there's John F. Kennedy. What are they selling? They're selling the memories of an East Coast wealthy childhood in the 60s. That's what Abercrombie and Fitch is actually selling. Yeah, I'm surprised he didn't use Hollister. That one always just makes me crack up. Because I think of Hollister, when I think of Hollister, I think of like artichokes and garlic because it's an ag area. It's not at the beach, but Hollister, they're selling an image. They're not selling reality. That marketing is never about selling reality. Marketing is about selling a brand or a lifestyle or an identity to you. Place product packaging used by chain-based customers. What could you once eat at the store on the right? How do you know? So, yeah, we know what these are. We know what they look like. Hamburger stands were designed initially to assure customers that you weren't going to die eating their polluted meat. And some of them kept that style as things changed and Americans forgot that hamburger used to be incredibly scary and dangerous to eat. Upton Sinclair in his book The Jungle talked about the meat industry in Chicago back in the early 1900s. Hamburger stands were trying to convince you it's hygienic, it's safe, it's clean. And over time, they've changed their image. Ooh, that's it for that. All right, that's it for the first week, the first part of Economics and Development. I hope you have a good week.